April 2024 brought a fascinating spectacle to the geopolitical stage. The Financial Times published a highly coordinated report claiming that Iran's unprecedented missile precision was entirely reliant on advanced high-resolution Chinese satellites. Within days, the political echo chamber activated. American cable news networks, like CNN, amplified the narrative, culminating in Donald Trump publicly declaring that if Beijing was indeed providing this targeting data, he would slap a staggering 50% tariff on Chinese goods. It is a highly compelling story, complete with shadowy superpower collusion and high-tech espionage. There is only one problem. It fundamentally ignores the reality of modern aerospace economics. To understand why this media narrative completely falls apart, we have to look directly at the data. The global commercial satellite imaging market is currently valued at over $3 billion, a figure projected to more than triple by the end of this decade. We are no longer living in the Cold War era, where high-resolution orbital surveillance was the exclusive, highly classified monopoly of Washington or Moscow. Today, the democratization of open-source intelligence means that anyone with a corporate credit card and an internet connection can purchase military-grade, sub-meter resolution imagery. Consider the American aerospace titans. Companies like Maxar Technologies and Planet Labs operate massive constellations of low Earth orbit satellites. Planet Labs alone commands a fleet of roughly 200 imaging satellites, systematically capturing millions of square kilometers of the Earth's surface every single day. We are talking about commercial image resolutions down to 30 centimeters per pixel. That is sharp enough to identify the exact dimensions of a hardened radar installation or the layout of an airbase. European aerospace firms, Indian tech startups, and Chinese commercial entities are all competing aggressively in this exact same global marketplace. When Western analysts point to Iranian forces utilizing high-quality satellite coordinates, their immediate jump to state-sponsored Chinese military intelligence is a deliberate misdirection. The acquisition of these images is, in the vast majority of cases, a pure commercial transaction. It is entirely plausible and historically consistent that the targeting data used by various actors in the Middle East was purchased legally from an American or European commercial provider, funneled seamlessly through a network of third-party shell companies. Washington possesses the regulatory tools to investigate its own commercial aerospace sector and its international clients. Yet the political establishment prefers to look the other way. The modern stratosphere is no longer a walled fortress guarded exclusively by superpower militaries. It has become a crowded, hyper-capitalist bazaar where critical data is simply sold to the highest bidder. Why let basic market realities ruin a perfectly convenient political narrative, blaming a sovereign state's military intelligence apparatus, rather than acknowledging the uncontrollable global proliferation of commercial data serves a very distinct political purpose. It allows politicians to threaten tariffs and display artificial strength without addressing the uncomfortable truth that technology has irreversibly leveled the playing field of modern warfare. When a fading hegemon can no longer control the heavens, it simply chooses to invent a convenient villain in the clouds. The strategic necessity of this China threat narrative becomes blindingly obvious when you examine the brutal mathematics of the modern Middle Eastern battlefield. For over 2 decades, the U.S. has poured an estimated $8 trillion into its post-9/11 military footprint across the region. Washington routinely deploys multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers, floating fortresses of power projection, surrounded by advanced cruisers and destroyers, operating under the historical assumption of absolute regional dominance. The daily operational cost of maintaining just one American carrier strike group in these waters hovers around $8 million. Yet, despite this staggering concentration of traditional military hardware, the Western coalition has found itself fundamentally paralyzed by Tehran's mastery of asymmetric warfare. The deeply uncomfortable reality is that the U.S., even after deploying its immense naval power directly into the theater, has failed to decisively deter Iran. We are currently witnessing an unsustainable equation: million-dollar precision-guided interceptors being launched by Western navies to shoot down mass-produced Iranian drones that cost barely $20,000 to assemble. The financial and strategic attrition is entirely one-sided. For the old aristocratic establishments of Europe and the policy architects in Washington, this is not just a tactical setback. It is a profound psychological trauma. The traditional Western mindset, deeply rooted in centuries of imperial supremacy, simply cannot process the reality of being outmaneuvered and out-endured by the Persians. It is a humiliation that shatters the foundational myth of their absolute, unquestionable military dominance. If a coalition of the world's wealthiest militaries cannot suppress a heavily sanctioned, isolated regional power, the geopolitical implications are absolutely catastrophic. Therefore, a psychological and political defense mechanism is urgently required. Iran cannot be permitted to stand alone as the victor in this strategic equation. The West desperately needs a phantom superpower lurking in the shadows to justify its own systemic failures. If Washington admits it is unable to defeat Tehran on its own terms, the embarrassment is devastating. But if Washington can convince the world and its own domestic voters that it is actually fighting a shadow war against the vast technological and intelligence apparatus of Beijing, the humiliation is instantly neutralized. Struggling against a peer competitor like China is an acceptable geopolitical narrative. Losing strategic control to a regional adversary is an existential crisis, like an aging grandmaster who furiously blames the lighting in the room rather than admitting he was outplayed by a younger challenger. The Western security establishment must construct a global conspiracy to mask its local paralysis. When a fading empire fails to win the war on the ground, it must immediately manufacture an enemy large enough to justify its defeat. The panic rippling through Western capitals is not just about military prestige. It is fundamentally about macroeconomic liability and a broken geopolitical contract. To grasp the sheer scale of the panic, we must look at the financial architecture of the Persian Gulf. We are talking about nations like the UAE and Qatar, whose sovereign wealth funds collectively command trillions of dollars in global assets. Their domestic economies, heavily reliant on monumental foreign direct investment and the uninterrupted export of liquefied natural gas and crude oil, require an environment of absolute stability. For decades, the foundational bedrock of that stability has been the implicit ironclad defense guarantee provided by the U.S. and its European allies, acting as the nominal protectors of these wealthy overseas nations. But what happens when that multi-billion-dollar shield shatters? Over the course of the recent conflict, we have witnessed landmark infrastructure, the very symbols of Gulf prosperity and economic invulnerability in places like the UAE and Qatar, repeatedly targeted and struck. The psychological shock in Abu Dhabi and Doha cannot be overstated. The Western security umbrella, marketed for decades as the ultimate insurance policy, abruptly proved utterly porous. This failure triggers an immediate and terrifying diplomatic crisis for Washington. The Gulf states, having paid a premium for protection, are entirely justified in their outrage. The unspoken question echoing through the halls of the Pentagon and the State Department is devastating. If our defense systems fail to protect the most lucrative real estate in the Middle East, what happens if the UAE and Qatar demand financial compensation from us? Washington knows that demanding reparations from Tehran is a diplomatic dead end. Iran has its own long-standing list of historical grievances and compensation demands, making it practically impossible to force them to pay. The massive financial and political liability is hovering dangerously over the architects of this failed security architecture, leaving them with no choice but to construct a scapegoat, shifting the ultimate blame directly onto China. This is precisely why the media narrative was engineered. When the Financial Times specifically includes a line claiming that Chinese satellites were used to surveil civilian facilities in overseas countries, it is not an exercise in objective journalism. It is a highly calculated legal and diplomatic deflection designed to sow discord. The message Washington and London are subtly broadcasting to their furious Gulf allies is crystal clear. Do not look at our failed interceptors. Do not ask us for a strategic refund, and certainly do not ask us for compensation. Instead, direct your anger toward the East and demand the money from Beijing. It is a desperate attempt to drive a wedge between the Arab states and their largest trading partner. like a highly paid bodyguard who sleeps through an assassination attempt, only to wake up and frantically blame a distant bystander for drawing the map. The West is trying to litigate its way out of a catastrophic failure. A security guarantee is only as strong as the metal it is forged from, and paper narratives cannot deflect ballistic realities. If we look closely at this manufactured panic, a distinct sense of déjà vu begins to set in. We do not even need to search deep into the historical archives to find the origins of this exact diplomatic strategy. The Western political establishment utilized this precise playbook just a few years ago. When the conflict in Eastern Europe first erupted, the US and its European allies swiftly moved to frame the narrative, collectively accusing Beijing of secretly providing direct military and logistical support to the Russian armed forces. Let US examine the staggering financial realities of that theater. Over the past few years, the NATO alliance has channeled well over $200 billion in direct military, financial, and humanitarian aid into Kyiv. We are talking about an unprecedented transfer of advanced weaponry, ranging from HIMARS, rocket artillery, to state-of-the-art main battle tanks and sophisticated air defense arrays. Yet despite this astronomical investment of capital and hardware, the Western-backed Ukrainian forces ultimately failed to decisively overpower the Russian military apparatus on the ground. For the policy architects in Washington and Brussels, who had heavily mortgaged their political credibility on a swift and total victory, this battlefield stalemate was intensely humiliating. The solution to this embarrassment was instantly familiar. Rather than acknowledging their own strategic miscalculations, they had to deflect the blame. They began systematically circulating rumors that the only reason they were not winning was because China was quietly tipping the scales. The rhetoric reached such fevered pitches that some Western officials even began floating the extreme, unprecedented idea of aggressively confiscating Chinese overseas assets as retaliation. The narrative only ground to a halt when reality was injected directly into the conversation. It was Ambassador Zheng Shuang who delivered a devastatingly simple truth that forced the US, Europe, and Russia into a profound, uncomfortable silence. He stated clearly that if China had actually chosen to supply weapons and direct military support to Russia, the situation on the battlefield would look vastly different than its current state. Why did this single sentence effectively silence the international political theater? Because it forced Western analysts to confront the terrifying industrial reality they desperately wanted to ignore. If the world's largest manufacturing superpower, possessing a shipbuilding capacity hundreds of times greater than that of the US and an unparalleled industrial base, truly decided to open its arsenals, it would not be a secret operation requiring media speculation. The sheer volume of material would physically alter the geopolitical center of gravity. This blame-shifting strategy has become a standardized crisis communication tool for Washington, like a desperate gambler who, having lost his entire fortune at the roulette table, furiously accuses the casino of rigging the wheel rather than admitting he simply played a terrible hand. The West continuously recycles this narrative of Chinese interference. It is not designed to uncover the truth. It is designed to manage the political fallout of a failing empire. A geopolitical strategy built entirely on manufactured illusions is destined to collapse the moment it makes contact with industrial reality. While the Western media establishment spins tales of secret satellite networks and shadow diplomacy, the internet ecosystem has generated its own distinct brand of sensationalism. Over the past few weeks, social media platforms have been absolutely flooded with viral, entirely unsubstantiated claims regarding direct Chinese military intervention in the Middle East. Some commentators excitedly suggested that Chinese naval vessels, such as the guided missile frigate Daqing, were aggressively repositioning toward the vital choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. Even more outlandish rumors circulated, claiming that the Fujian aircraft carrier was somehow preparing for an imminent Gulf deployment. While these narratives might provide a thrilling geopolitical fantasy for online audiences, they reveal a profound misunderstanding of basic military logistics and, more importantly, a complete ignorance of a civilization with 5,000 years of strategic patience. Let us separate internet hyperbole from the hard data of Beijing's actual grand strategy. China's official stance on military exports and overseas deployments is not governed by internet algorithms or reactionary panic. It is strictly regulated by one of the most cautious, meticulously calculated legal frameworks in the world. As Beijing spokespersons have repeatedly and explicitly stated on the international stage, their approach to military exports is prudent, responsible, and subject to rigorous domestic oversight. They fundamentally reject the malicious associations and baseless smears engineered by Western analysts. To understand why China has absolutely no intention of sending carrier strike groups to police the Persian Gulf, you must look at their actual economic footprint in the region. Beijing's strategy in the Middle East is fundamentally built on commerce, not kinetic warfare. Since the inception of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has directed hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, technology transfers, and energy contracts into the Arab world. In recent years, bilateral trade between China and the Middle East has routinely surpassed $300 billion annually. Beijing is heavily invested in securing long-term energy supplies, building automated megaports, rolling out advanced 5G networks, and constructing high-speed rail lines across the desert. Contrast this immense economic architecture with the traditional Western approach. While Washington spends roughly $8 million every single day operating a single aircraft carrier to patrol the Gulf, and while politicians threaten catastrophic 50% tariffs based on rumors, Beijing is negotiating comprehensive strategic partnerships. They are quietly brokering historic diplomatic breakthroughs, such as the unprecedented Saudi and Iran normalization agreement. China views the Middle East as a crucial integrated node in a rapidly expanding global economic network, not a permanent theater for military adventurism. They recognize that deploying heavy naval assets into a highly volatile choke point like the Strait of Hormuz would actively jeopardize their own massive economic interests and directly contradict their core diplomatic principle of non-interference. A true geopolitical master builds enduring bridges over turbulent waters rather than anchoring fragile warships in the rapids. During a recent press briefing, when a journalist asked about Donald Trump's threat to impose a 50% tariff over these satellite rumors, the Chinese spokesperson delivered a masterclass in diplomatic clarity. The response was brief, yet deeply profound. There are no winners in a tariff war. This simple truth extends far beyond economics. There are no winners in a tariff war, and there are certainly no winners in a world driven by geopolitical scapegoating. As Western empires struggle to maintain their grip on a rapidly multipolar Middle East, the instinct to point fingers at Beijing will only grow stronger. But paper narratives do not intercept ballistic missiles, and media spin does not rebuild shattered alliances. The global order is fundamentally shifting, and reality is demanding a much higher price than a 50% tariff. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you want to keep cutting through the noise of international relations, make sure to subscribe. I am Daniel Mercer, and I will see you in the next one.